Welcome to Talking Live. I'm Dr. Robi Ludwig, and right now everybody is thinking about jobs, the workplace, what is next, and do I have the perfect guest to answer this question? He just wrote a book. He's a best-selling author. This book is called Success Mindset. Ryan Gottfredson is going to tell us how to be a good boss, how to be a good worker, and what we can look forward to in this new post-pandemic world. Ryan, welcome.
Thanks for having me. You're putting a lot of pressure on. You're acting like I have all the answers. I don't feel like I have all the answers.
You have a lot of answers. You know, it's so funny. When I was reading through your book and looking at some of your points, I was just thinking about just my own experience in the workplace and my patient's experience in the workplace, especially when it's been negative. And I read this quote that people don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad environments and bad bosses. And I thought, isn't that the case?
All the time, that's the case. And here's the thing that's interesting about it. I mean, let me give you some statistics. 60% of employees say that their manager damages their self-esteem. 65% of employees say that they would rather have a new boss compared to more pay. And 75% of employees say that their boss is the worst and most stressful part of their job. So that's what the employees are experiencing. But when I go and I work with organizations, I'll step into a room full of leaders. And one of the first questions I'll ask is, are you trying your best? And they'll all say, yes, I'm trying my best. And so for me, this is so interesting because there's this huge disconnect between leaders, what they feel like is their best, and what employees are receiving. And that's what shapes the workplace.
Absolutely. And I also wonder if people are trying their best, because I also hear the other side where I will have bosses say they're very frustrated with the people who work underneath them, that they feel they're not smart enough, they're not working hard enough, or they're not bringing their A game. So I think certain personalities lend themselves better to being a better boss. And you talk a little bit about this in your book.
Yeah, and let me just change the vernacular just a little bit. I think it's less about personalities and more about our mindsets. So personality is kind of our natural dispositions, things that we really can't change. Mindsets are the lenses, the mental lenses that we wear that shape how we view the world. And depending upon how we view the world, that shapes how we think, learn, and behave. And our mindsets exist for most of us non-consciously, and they're driving 90% of our thinking, feeling, judging, and acting. So if we can help our leaders awaken to these non-conscious mindsets, we can empower them to operate better.
How do you get somebody to want to be more aware? Because there are a lot of people that are scared to look inwards.
Well, I mean, you work with a lot of people as a psychotherapist that come to you and they say, I want X, but also at the same time, I've got a whole lot of fears and self-limiting beliefs that are going on. And so what goes on for most people is we've got the foot on the gas pedal with regards to the goals that we have. But what we oftentimes don't recognize is we've got our other foot on the brake pedal with certain mindset fueled fears and commitments that are preventing us to get to where we want to go. Can I give you just a quick example of that?
Absolutely. I was just going to ask, give me an example. What's a fear that somebody experiences that would get them to misbehave, if you will?
Yeah, let me share with you an experience I had with my daughter. So my daughter is now 8 years old, but 2 years ago she came to me and she said that she wanted to learn how to ice skate. I said, okay, that's great. I'm happy to explore signing you up for lessons, but let's just go ice skating, and because she had never been before, and let's just try it out. And so we put her on ice skates, which she had never been in before. She's kind of wobbling around, and we get on this ice, which is the slippery, cold, and hard surface. And for the next hour and a half, my daughter essentially just hugged the wall and shuffled around the ice skating rink. And we probably only got around the rink twice. And the whole time I'm trying to be positive and encourage her to step away from the wall and kind of try things out on her own. But she was reluctant to do so. And here's what was going on, is my daughter, while she said she wanted to learn how to ice skate. That's her foot on the gas pedal. She also had what's called a prevention mindset, which when she's focused on avoiding problems. And so with that mindset, that is driving some fears, which are of falling and of getting hurt. And so she has this commitment for her own safety. So right there, she's got two competing desires: learning how to ice skate and protecting herself. And she's battling with that, and she's weighting that protecting herself so much more than learning how to ice skate. And because of that, she's got one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake, and the brake is what is driving that car. And hence, she isn't making any progress. And so for each of us, we've all got our own deep-seated fears and commitments that are preventing us from getting where we want to go. But if we can look at this through the lens of mindsets, we can help people awaken to these things and make significant shifts in terms of how they think and process and operate.
So I'm sure you've heard this from workers, maybe not bosses, but people who work for bosses. There are some bosses that like to intimidate, that like to induce fear. And they feel like the bottom line is all that matters. They care about money. And as long as they're earning and doing well and meeting those numbers, that's all that counts. What do you say to someone like that?
But first of all, I'm sympathetic to them because I've been there with different bosses that I've had. And I think what is important to recognize, again, that our bosses, even though that they have kind of this negative disposition, they are trying the best that they can. And they don't recognize that there's just a better way to operate. And so what we're really getting at in terms of this example is the difference between an inward mindset and an outward mindset. And this is one of 4 sets that I talk about in my book. And when you have an inward mindset, you see yourself as being more important than others, which causes you to see others as objects or instruments there to get you where you want to go. When you have an outward mindset, you see others as being just as important as yourself. And therefore, you're able to see them as people and value them as such. And so what's going on is when a leader has an inward mindset, they have a fear of getting passed up. So they're committed to advancing, and they become willing to step on others in order to get there. And this is totally justifiable to them. But when we look at it from the observer perspective, it clearly seems that something is wrong. And it's just difficult for that leader to understand that until you can awaken them to their mindsets. And then once you can get there, then you can deepen their self-awareness and help create the shifts that are needed.
So you have a lot of faith in human nature. It's
Well,
a very positive.
I try to.
I do too, but I've also seen kind of the dark side where there are people that just feel like, hey, listen, I had it hard, so I'm going to make it hard for you. Do you find that there are any gender generalities? Like, do you find people like male bosses better than female bosses or vice versa?
Well, I haven't found anything necessarily in terms of, I have a personal mindset assessment anybody could take. It's free that they could evaluate their mindsets. And I haven't seen a difference in terms of gender. Like everybody, some women have great mindsets, some men have great mindsets, and then vice versa.
Yeah.
But what I do know from the data is that women generally make better managers than men do. And it's partly because, and what experts have suggested, is because they're a little bit more disposed to see the bigger picture instead of the right now. And when you're focused on the right now, you're usually focused on yourself. So women have a little bit greater capability, it seems like, maybe because of social pressures, of being a little bit more compassionate to the collective group as opposed to that individual. And don't get me wrong, there's some men that do that really well. It's just as a whole, women seem to do it a little bit better than men.
It's in my personal experience, and I realize it's highly individualized, I've always really enjoyed my male bosses versus female bosses. I've found some female bosses, and listen, I'm a woman's woman, but I think some women get very competitive and can cross the boundary of personal and professional, which makes it complex. But, listen, you get somebody who's nurturing and who cares, who wants the people working underneath them to have a good experience. That's a blessing.
Yeah, what we're finding in the research is what leadership researchers are calling, for women leaders, the queen bee syndrome. And
Yeah.
so there is some of that can go on, where you work so hard to get to where you are that you want to protect where you're at. And that's just another form of an inward mindset, is because you're focused on yourself and your position. And the desire associated with an inward mindset is a desire to get ahead.
Yeah.
And that's a very justifiable desire. Nobody wants to get passed up. But what we don't recognize is that there's a higher order desire to have, and that's associated with this outward mindset. And that's a desire to lift others. And what I've learned, because I've had to make these shifts myself, what I've learned for myself is the more that I focus on my own success, the harder it is to obtain it. The more I focus on other success, the easier it is for me to be successful. And it seems somewhat counterintuitive, but it works. It's how it plays out.
You know, I agree with you. I always view the workplaces, there really is enough for everybody. And we see that now, like even in media, look how many channels there are, look how many outlets there are to show one's creativity. And it's so much nicer when you're helping somebody else and vice versa, and they give to you in kind, or just to have a nicer, friendly workplace. I mean, that counts for a lot in terms of mental health as well. Let's talk about the pandemic and what people are experiencing and how they can position themselves for the modern workplace. First of all, what do you see the workplace looking like?
Well, I see a scary element of it, and I see a great element. So the scary part of it for me is that, and it's with any crisis, whether it's global or localized, any crisis is going to incentivize us to want to self-protect. So when we face a crisis, we're going to be like this turtle that's pulling our head in our shell and wanting to protect. But when we do that, we're taking on more of the negative mindsets that are causing us to operate in ways that are best for us. But oftentimes when we're doing that, we're not sensitive to the needs of those around us. And so that's one of the things I'm a little scared of, that this is going to shift mindsets more towards the negative. But one of the opportunities that I see, and we'll see this in select pockets, is rather than focus on self-protecting, we focus more on how do we help advance. And when we start focusing on that, that's when we start to develop more of the positive mindsets. And what I'm finding is that I think we've been on a shift for a while now, that we've focused as consumers have focused less on the goods that they're receiving or the services that they're receiving. And they're starting to focus more and more on the value that is being provided to them. And so what has now happened with this pandemic is even more the consumer is focused on what value are you providing to me? And if a company is focused on sales conversions, profits, revenues, then they're actually going to miss out because they're focused on the numbers and not on creating value for the consumer. So now more than ever, organizations need to focus on what value are you providing and have that fully outward mindset towards the consumer. And then when they have that mindset, then what will happen is the sales, the revenues, and the profits will take care of themselves because the consumer is getting value. So all these organizations that we see going under, I think we could make a very strong correlation between how they have viewed their consumer as a dollar sign or as a person.
I agree with you. I just was going to say, like, especially now with social distancing and everything happening via Zoom, which is wonderful, but a lot of people are missing out in that social connection. Just even saying hello to somebody on the way to work or on the way up to your office, you know, we're missing that personal connection. And I do think that the more that bosses or companies can provide that personal attention, the more successful they'll be, because we need that.
Yeah. So I'm a former Gallup consultant, which goes into organizations when we assess employee engagement, or when I was there, we would assess employee engagement of the workplace. And Gallup has 12 questions that they ask employees to see if they're engaged. So these are questions like, Do I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day? Do I have the materials and equipment needed to perform my job? And so there's 12 questions, and they're all important for engagement. But I always had the question prior to working at Gallup, is there one or two of these that are more important than all the others? And so I got my hands on as much data as I could when I was at Gallup. And what I found is that there are two questions that seem to drive engagement. The first one is, do my opinions count at work? So when an employee can strongly agree to this, 95% of them are engaged. So if we feel like we have a voice, we feel valued. Then the second one was, somebody at work cares about me as a person. If an employee gives a 1 through 4, meaning that they can't strongly agree, only 12% of employees are engaged. And so what this means for me, and you nailed it right on the head, is even though we are working remotely from each other, that doesn't negate the importance of helping people ensure that they have a voice and that they're cared about as a person. And if those aren't there, then they're not going to be engaged.
One final topic you bring up in this book, and I thought it was really interesting, is that, as bosses, they need to be able to face the pain in order to become the good boss that they want to be. Can you tell me a little bit more about that idea?
Well, it's part of the self-awareness journey. Is when we're just starting out, we think we're a lot better than what we really are. And then at some point in time, if we allow ourselves, we're going to come crashing down to earth. And we shouldn't see that as a bad thing, but it's oftentimes, and in my own personal experience, it's just not that easy. It's a little bit painful to come to the realization that you may not be the person that you thought that you were, and that maybe your best intentions actually had a negative impact on those around you. And so that's a very humbling place to be, but that's actually what leaders have to go through to be the mindful servant leaders that we want them to be. And it's just part of this, it's part of the self-awareness journey. And the more that we can do this, what we're actually doing is we're enhancing what experts are calling our mental maturity, our ability to navigate complex situations. And that's an essential characteristic for effective leadership.
That I love that, just that maturity component, because it's so true. If you are mature, you're willing to grow, you're willing to accept that you're imperfect. Being right is not as important. This is such a valuable book, especially right now as we move into a new workplace, basically, with sound principles. So I'm going to recommend that everybody get your book, Success Mindsets. We're going to have a link up so everybody can get it. And what I like is you can take your own questionnaire, and there are results to find out what kind of boss you are. And there are recommendations for readings and TED Talks and all those kinds of things. So it's a really great resource. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thanks for having me on, and thanks for promoting the book. Let me just add one quick thing, that I love having a hard copy, and I also love listening to books. So if you go to my website and you buy the hard copy through my website, I'll give you the audiobook for free.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. Well, we're going to have a link up so everybody can find you, and best of luck to you in your book. And thanks for joining us on Talking Live.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Robi. Really appreciate it.